violence since the revolutionary blockade against Lithuania, according to the Republic's Prime Minister. Mrs. Kazimiera Prunskiene said the Soviet Union had promised to restore some supplies of gas and raw materials to the Republic. Earlier, she'd met the Soviet Prime Minister, Nikolai Rushkov. The Soviet Union imposed its blockade 2 months ago in an attempt to force Lithuania to abandon its declaration of independence. From Moscow, Justin Webb.
Moscow's sanctions against Lithuania have caused intense and continuing hardship. With fuel in short supply, most factories have closed and 40,000 people are out of work. Tonight, the Soviet news agency TASS said some fuel and raw material supplies were being restored. TASS quoted the Lithuanian Prime Minister, Kazimiera Prunskiene, as saying she had no doubt the economic blockade would be lifted. Moscow's peace offensive had been signalled by an official spokesman who talked of a new and generous offer to the Baltic leaders from President Gorbachev.
The President of the Soviet Union has made a gigantic step forward in offering his olive branch and a compromise.
That compromise was offered to the three Baltic presidents when they met President Gorbachev in Moscow yesterday. Previously, Moscow had told the three that their declarations of independence must be suspended before talks. Now it seems the Soviet government will accept merely the freezing of the declarations at the moment talks begin, and that they regard as a highly significant offer.
If they take that path, I believe that that will open great opportunities which could bring about further talks with these republics.
In the light of this upbeat mood, it seems President Gorbachev felt he could afford to relax his grip on Lithuania in the hope that the atmosphere would be further improved. This evening, Soviet television has shown pictures of President Landsbergis of Lithuania, the most anti-Soviet of the three leaders, telling his parliament that the talks in Moscow had been friendly. His Prime Minister is already reported to be saying the idea of freezing the independence declaration is worth considering. It seems that neither President Gorbachev nor the Baltic leaders have the stomach anymore for a fight. The way could be open for the solution of one of the Soviet Union's seemingly intractable problems. Justin Webb,
BBC. The Prime Minister of Lithuania has said that Moscow has agreed to a partial lifting of the economic blockade against the Republic. And the President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, said he and President Gorbachev had now agreed to work together for the common good. That came soon after Mr. Gorbachev's broad proposal for the introduction of a market economy was accepted by Parliament, but the details were left for further negotiation.
In the Lithuanian Parliament this evening, President Vytautas Landsbergis said his meeting yesterday with Mikhail Gorbachev had been sincere and friendly, and added, "I think we are moving forwards successfully." Prime Minister Kazimiera Prunskiene was more specific. After further meetings in Moscow today, she said the Kremlin had already started to ease its economic sanctions against Lithuania. Soviet spokesman Arkady Maslenikov said Mr. Gorbachev had dropped his demand that Lithuania rescind its declaration of independence, asking instead that it be frozen during negotiations. The Lithuanians issued their historic declaration on March the 11th and almost immediately came under pressure from Moscow. Less than 2 weeks later, a big military convoy rolled past the Parliament building in what many saw as a clear threat. And sanctions have disrupted petrol and gas supplies and thrown 40,000 people out of work. Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Rushkov was the central figure in today's Lithuanian talks, but he's facing a more serious challenge on his own doorstep.
The Republic's President, Vytautas Landsbergis, said that more time was needed to consider the options. But the Prime Minister, Mrs. Prunskiene, told the Parliament the declaration should be suspended. She said that President Gorbachev had assured her by phone that this would mean the end of economic sanctions against Lithuania and the start of independence talks with Moscow.
In an effort to thrash out a compromise. The two leaders arrived in Moscow for a second round of unofficial talks in as many days. The Kremlin has demanded a freeze of the independence declaration before any official discussions can go ahead. In return, Moscow will lift its economic blockade of the Republic.
Talks on the future of its bid for independence from Moscow. The Republic's leaders will discuss plans to freeze the declaration in return for an end to the 3-month Soviet trade embargo that's badly hit Lithuania's economy. President Landsbergis yesterday held talks with President Gorbachev on a possible compromise.
Landsbergis and Prime Minister Kazimiera Prunskiene was an attempt to break the deadlock between their desire for independence and Gorbachev's wish to hold the Union together. Gorbachev wants Lithuania to freeze its March independence declaration before he'll talk about its future status. and the Lithuanian leadership is under pressure from the Soviet economic embargo. Lithuania's Supreme Council will today debate whether to compromise by freezing independence, and the President and Prime Minister returned to Vilnius last night to report on whether they believe Mr. Gorbachev will compromise too. And back in Moscow, pressure for the Soviet leader from his other power base, the Communist Party. A decision is expected tomorrow on whether to go ahead with next week's crucial Soviet Party Congress, following the unexpected strong conservative showing at last week's Russian party gathering. But yesterday, Politburo member Vadim Medvedev said it was too late to postpone. If the Communist Congress goes ahead, there'll be a bumpy ride as those for and against perestroika air their differences.
She indicated that it was Lithuanian political squabbles that had pushed her to resign, though the overall context is inescapable, one of Moscow tightening its military grip on the recalcitrant Baltic Republic. For months, she's not seen eye to eye with Lithuania's president, Vytautas Landsbergis. The former music professor is a more radical, fierier nationalist. The heady days of last March, when tiny Lithuania declared UDI and cocked a snook at Moscow, are long gone. Lithuania was swallowed whole by Stalin in 1940. In March, Lithuania's parliament said goodbye to a dolorous half-century of rule by Moscow. But within months, Mr. Gorbachev had forced a climb down. Soviet power and economic realities had to be faced. Mrs. Pronskiene shuttled around world leaders last year seeking support for an independent Lithuania. But the brutal truth she met was their greater concern for the survival of Mr. Gorbachev, and no friend he to an independent Lithuania. What perhaps precipitated her resignation today was a half-hour audience in Moscow she had with the Soviet president. When she tried to discuss Moscow's deployment of thousands of paratroops to Lithuania and other republics, Mr. Gorbachev, we're told, sent her away with a flea in her ear. She got back to Vilnius to find pro-Moscow demonstrators trying to batter their way into the Lithuanian parliament, mainly resident Russians and Poles. They were purportedly protesting against big rises in food prices. Within no time, summoned to parliament by President Landsbergis, Lithuanian Sąjūdis nationalists laid on a counter-rally. But with the cool-headed Mrs. Pronskiene, that champion of dialogue, now stepping down, who is to keep the Kremlin at bay? And there's no doubt about the troop deployments. They were ordered yesterday. Their nominal task is to tighten up on draft dodging. But Estonia's Prime Minister had no illusions. The aim, he said today, is to overcome the Baltic independence movements. Blood could flow. Mr. Gorbachev, it seems, after long months of indecision, has decided not to preside over the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And what craftier time to send in the troops than now, with the world's attention focused on the Persian Gulf and Soviet support for American Gulf policy crucial to the White House.
So where do the resignations leave Lithuania? With us now is Romas Kinka of the Lithuanian reform movement, Sąjūdis. It is said, as David Sells mentioned in his report there, that she resigned over the question of food price rises, but he suggested it was to do more with what she'd heard from Mr. Gorbachev. What's your reading of it?
I agree with David Sells, absolutely. I think Mrs. Pronskiene returned a very disappointed Prime Minister. It has to be remembered that Mrs. Pronskiene was the main proponent, or the proponent, of negotiations with Moscow. She pushed that through Parliament. She pushed through the moratorium, the freezing of the Declaration of Independence, way back last summer when sanctions were being implemented.
So if she has gone as a proponent of negotiations, where does that leave relations between Moscow and Lithuania now?
There are no negotiations. They've never begun. That's part of the reason why she has resigned. It's really that simple. There have been talks about talks way back in October. The Lithuanian delegates who went to Moscow, headed by President Landsbergis, were, I think, wildly optimistic, coming back saying things have gone very well. In my estimation, there was no chance at all of negotiations ever taking place. And those Lithuanian MPs that voted against the moratorium will now be confirmed in their view, that there was no point.
Now, simultaneously with this, we've got these rather worrying development of the deployment of a division of Soviet troops in the Baltic states. The defiance of the call-up in the Baltic states is quite considerable. I mean, something like, I read a figure of 12% or something, young men registering for the draft.
Correct. Yes. That figure is absolutely correct. Now, you have to remember, of course, that the Lithuanians, together with the other Balts, regard the Soviet army, quite correctly, as an army of occupation. And they see no reason why they should serve in that army. At the same time, obviously, there have been any number of incidents, accidents, deaths, mutilations, people being beaten up, people returning damaged either physically or psychologically from the army.
So what is your reading of what's going to happen now?
Well, I think there will be a crackdown. I mean, one can't send in paratroopers and not use them. Once they've been sent in, they certainly will be used. Heads will be cracked. None of this really will make any great difference as far as the security of the states goes, or anything like that. What it's all about basically is the center imposing its will on those republics that have either declared independence, and Lithuania, by the way, is the only republic to have declared full independence, which is why it's getting it in the neck first. Unlike Latvia and Estonia that have been given a deadline, Lithuania, by the way, was not given any deadline. But Latvia has until Friday, Estonia has until Sunday, and it's not entirely a coincidence that the UN deadline is on the 15th.
Romas Kinka, thank you very much.
By the Soviet government's actions.
For thousands of the independence demonstrators now outside the Lithuanian parliament, it's a second night of vigil after yesterday's attempted mass break-in by their political opponents. Tonight, the threat is of military force, and the Republic's president, Vytautas Landsbergis, called on all his people for support.
They are preparing for the attack against parliament.
Moscow's interior ministry says the troops now flooding into the Lithuanian capital are here only to enforce the draft laws. But parliamentary deputies say the armed threat to independence is evident.
This would be a pretext to start really a bloody suppression, use of force in a massive scale.
It's beginning to look very much like an attempt to destabilize the situation in the Baltics, and to that extent to provide a pretext for Moscow to intervene more directly in matters that really the Balts think should be theirs.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin has warned that sending troops into the Baltic republics will only lead to violence. Condemnation by America and France was dismissed today by TASS as foreign interference. Troops are also heading for the Republic of Georgia, where deputies voted to defy an order from President Gorbachev to remove their own police from a territorial dispute in Ossetia. Members said any attempt to enforce Moscow's will would be an act of war.
For and against rule by Moscow eventually passed off peacefully, despite fears that they could be used as a pretext to provoke unrest.
Soviet armored vehicles outside Lithuania's television station, part of today's deployment by the Red Army, which made Moscow's intentions abundantly clear: to intimidate the Republic's nationalist government and turn a long simmering dispute into an open confrontation. Thousands of demonstrators, some supporting, some opposing the government's independence drive, gathered outside the Lithuanian parliament. President Vytautas Landsbergis appearing at an open window to make an emotional appeal for calm, but also calling on nationalist sympathizers to protect the building and the Republic's leadership from a possible assault. In Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, in a meeting with Japanese politicians, condemned Mr. Gorbachev's decision to send troops to the Baltics, saying that violence would breed greater violence and that the Kremlin should instead offer negotiations. But a Soviet spokesman made clear that Moscow had no hesitation in taking whatever action was necessary in the region.
Sometimes tough decisions, sometimes clearly things which might be unpopular in the country or in the world for that matter, must be taken, and if we feel, or the leadership feels, that there are certain things, even if they are unpopular, which must be done, they will be done.
With demonstrations intensifying and with troops on the streets, the Baltics and the Soviet Union are bracing for conflict. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
But the Lithuanian president, Vytautas Landsbergis, says that Moscow's authority no longer applies. Martin Sixsmith reports.
The statement read on national television was Mr. Gorbachev's toughest warning yet, and the first official acknowledgement that direct rule in Lithuania is being actively considered.
Urgent measures must be adopted. The people demand the restoration of constitutional order. They are demanding the imposition of presidential rule.
In fact, most Lithuanians are demanding independence. Tens of thousands of them turned out this afternoon following an appeal by President Landsbergis for nationalist sympathisers to protect the Republic's parliament from attack. The crowd responded with chants and banners denouncing the threat of a Soviet crackdown and rejecting Mr. Gorbachev's ultimatum as an act of aggression. Inside the parliament, President Landsbergis poured scorn on the suggestion that Lithuanians would welcome a return to rule by the Kremlin. But in Moscow, the outgoing foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, who last month warned of the dangers of dictatorship, rejected suggestions that it had now begun.
I can't say that this is a display of dictatorship. It's a desire to restore order, because we can't live under chaos and anarchy. It's chaos and anarchy that can lead to dictatorship.
In Lithuania's sister republic of Latvia, it was pro-Moscow demonstrators who took to the streets today, the mainly Russian Interfront movement, demanding the resignation of the nationalist government and calling for protest strikes, vocally expressing the views of the large non-Latvian minority who are opposed to independence and are pressing for tough action by the Kremlin. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Doesn't obey Soviet law. He said the people were demanding the restoration of order. The Lithuanian president, Mr. Landsbergis, this evening nominated a social democrat, Mr. Albertas Šimenis, as prime minister, in place of Mrs. Prunskiene, who resigned on Tuesday. Mr. Šimenis said if there was no open Soviet aggression, he would try to develop Lithuanian-Soviet relations, but on the basis of full Lithuanian independence.
Today's ultimatum has set this breakaway republic on a direct collision course with Moscow. Parliament here in Vilnius has effectively been told to reverse all the legislation passed since it declared independence last year. Moscow has proclaimed these local politicians powerless. But Lithuania's president in response seems determined to ignore Moscow.
The Soviet constitution is not valid in a country that was annexed by Stalin.
The ultimatum was strongly worded, accusing Lithuania of breaching Soviet law and restoring a bourgeois system under the slogan of democracy. It was written in the name of Mr. Gorbachev himself. There's been no sign of any military activity in the city, although the general at this base told ITN paratroopers had arrived and were in place behind these walls. They've come to find men like 18-year-old Mindaugas Maksimavicius, who's refused the call-up. Lithuanian law allows that, Soviet law does not.
I can never serve in an army opposed to my nation. I will go into hiding if necessary. I am prepared to fight back.
Some volunteers guarding Parliament were today armed with guns amid fears the military could move in.
They are just waiting for some disturbances, some riots to intervene.
Pro-independence demonstrators once again took to the streets tonight. Their opponents are said to be planning a counter-demonstration. This ultimatum is the sternest warning to Lithuania so far. The situation here is becoming dangerously unstable, and Mr. Gorbachev's patience may be about to snap. Penny Marshall, News at 10.
Lithuania this weekend that left over 13 civilians dead. The Defence Minister, Marshal Yazov, said the action was taken on the initiative of the local Soviet military commander. European foreign ministers have threatened to stop aid for the Soviet Union if the military clampdown in the Baltic states goes on.
There was anger and disbelief in the Soviet parliament when Defence Minister Yazov backed his army's brutal action in Lithuania. The order to shoot, he said, had come not from Moscow, but the local garrison commander. And both he and the Interior Minister, Boris Pugo, claimed the troops had acted in self-defense in response to Lithuanian aggression. Not a view that matches the eyewitness accounts from Lithuania of brave civilians confronted by Soviet tanks and armed paratroops whose assault on the city's TV station ended in over 13 dead and more than 100 wounded. But President Gorbachev also stood by his defense ministry's version. Speaking in between sessions in the parliament, he said he'd only found out about the attack afterwards, on Sunday morning. But reporting to the full parliament, he pointedly did not condemn his troops. Instead, he blamed Lithuania for the tension which had led to the crisis, and said a dialogue would be difficult while Mr. Landsbergis remained in charge. As for Western reaction, President Gorbachev called on the world to show understanding, a view not everyone in his parliament shared.
If something happened in Lithuania today, or in Latvia tomorrow, or in Estonia tomorrow, you must stop every help to the Soviet Union.
Today's exchanges in the Kremlin gave little hope the Lithuanian crisis is over, and the Russian leader Boris Yeltsin warned he now feared a broader crackdown. Hastening back to Moscow after a fleeting visit to Estonia, he said the military threat in the Baltic states may be only the beginning of a well-planned attempt to put back the clock. In Lithuania today, hopes that last night's uneasy truce with the Soviet army could be extended were shattered when troops seized another building, described in Moscow as an underground radio station. Throughout the day, Lithuanians laid flowers at shrines to commemorate the victims of Sunday's violence, and there's widespread fear that the Soviet army may still storm the Republic's parliament, secure now in the knowledge it's backed by a Soviet president in Moscow who's determined to bring Lithuania to heel. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, Moscow.
And tensions been growing in the other Baltic states. Tonight, the Latvian government went into emergency session following a warning from the army that it should submit to Soviet rule. In the capital, Riga, thousands of people are on the streets guarding key buildings in case the Soviet army attacks. From Latvia, Martin Sixsmith reports.
This evening brought the first violence in an increasingly tense political standoff. These lorries had been part of the nationalist barricades, designed to keep Moscow's troops away from key buildings in Riga. But a unit of soldiers lost patience with the blockade and opened fire, causing extensive damage but no casualties. The barricades are everywhere, blocking major roads amid constant rumours that Soviet tanks are about to move in.
The Latvians are keenly aware of how Soviet tanks stormed buildings in Lithuania. This is the approach road to Latvia's television station, and hundreds of lorry drivers have answered an appeal to block the road to keep the tanks at bay.
Outside the TV station, volunteers are still arriving, braving freezing temperatures in what many see as their last chance to maintain Latvia's freedom. In the daylight hours, the state of siege in Riga becomes abundantly evident. Trucks, buses and makeshift barriers are now blocking every road around the parliament and the telephone exchange. Pedestrians have to queue patiently to pass endless checkpoints. And normal life has seemingly been suspended as the city waits to learn its fate. Latvian politicians met the region's military commanders this afternoon, the meeting ending with an ominous call from the pro-Moscow communists for the introduction of presidential rule and the replacement of the elected government by a Council for National Salvation. With Latvia's government headquarters defended by an ever-growing cordon of lorries, the founder of the Soviet state can only look on as the future of the country he created is decided on the streets. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Riga.
When troops stormed the radio and television center in the capital, Vilnius. In Washington, a White House spokesman said the violence had jeopardized next month's Moscow summit between President Bush and Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev said he hadn't ordered the troops to go in and was asleep when it happened.
Paratroopers once again moved against the people here this morning, despite Moscow's assurance of a peaceful solution to the crisis. They seized a radio relay station in Vilnius, this time without tanks and guns. But the independent supporters inside were forced out. Western correspondents were once again attacked. At least one camera was taken. All this just as President Landsbergis told Parliament that Mr. Gorbachev had spoken to him by phone this morning, urging a peaceful end to the confrontation. The vigil outside Parliament shows no sign of ending, and this morning's military action is once again prompting crowds to flock there. Moscow's peace delegation has been meeting with military chiefs this afternoon in an attempt to stop their actions. Tanks and paratroopers still hold threatening positions around the city. No one's allowed in and out of the buildings, and filming is illegal. There's now confusion about whose orders they are following, but the people here believe it's Moscow's.
Moscow mustn't do such, because we are peaceful and we want only our freedom.
It seems to me that Mr. Gorbachev knew about it, but he don't stop this action in Lithuania.
They're dead, they say, with the result of a Kremlin crackdown. And today they honored the victims of what has become known here as Bloody Sunday. Whoever was responsible for this tragedy,
The seeds of mistrust between the Baltic people and Moscow now run very deep indeed, and it will be a long time, if at all, before they trust the word of the Soviet president again. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Vilnius.
In Lithuania's neighbouring republic, Latvia, there is increasing tension tonight. Crowds have been gathering to defend key buildings. Barricades are in place. The Latvian government held a crisis meeting and warned it expected the Red Army to move in within the next 48 hours. There's an unconfirmed report that one person has already been shot. The local military commander has declared he intends to restore the Soviet constitution. At the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev revealed he was asleep when troops struck in Lithuania. I only learned when they got me up, he said. Later, he told the Supreme Soviet the garrison commander in Vilnius had ordered his men to launch the assault on the TV tower. The killings were a trying experience. We didn't want this, and we do not want it. And Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov said the attack was in response to anti-Soviet propaganda. Opposition MPs are outraged.
I think that maybe this is the end of our perestroika, because Mr. Gorbachev now understands that we are not maybe, he thinks that the people, Russian people, not ready to become independent.
Boris Yeltsin warned there was a powerful offensive against democracy and said his Russian Republic might form its own army. He claimed he'd been told of a threat on his life during a weekend visit to Estonia. These are increasingly tense days in the Soviet Union. Kremlin pronouncements about an end to the violence seem to mean little to the soldiers on the ground. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
And in an emotional speech to the Soviet Parliament, he furiously condemned the leader of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, who he said was losing his reason. Mr. Yeltsin had said that he might have to create a separate Russian army. Mr. Gorbachev called it a deliberate provocation. In Lithuania today, the Soviet army stepped up its pressure, strengthening its patrols and setting up military checkpoints in the capital. In Estonia, thousands of pro-Moscow demonstrators took to the streets demanding the overthrow of the pro-independence administration. And tension continued to rise in Latvia, where the communists also organized a huge rally.
President Gorbachev, red-faced, stumbling over his words in anger, denounced his chief rival Boris Yeltsin. He was inciting confrontation, Mr. Gorbachev said, by supporting independence for the Baltic states and suggesting the creation of a separate Russian army. Comrade Yeltsin should be self-critical and withdraw such appeals. Let's hope that common sense has not abandoned him for good. But in the Lithuanian capital Vilnius, the people are building defences against the Soviet army by digging anti-tank barriers around the parliament, which symbolises the power Lithuanians are struggling to hold. Lithuania's Foreign Minister Algirdas Saudargas is in London seeking British government support, even demanding Allied action against Iraq be postponed to stop Moscow seizing that moment to crush his people. Foreign Office Minister Douglas Hogg repeated Britain's commitment to a tough line with Moscow. The European community is already threatening to stop aid worth £500 million. Britain would like to go further. To underline the British government's support for the Baltic republics, the Lithuanian Foreign Minister has been promised another meeting at the Foreign Office, this time with the Foreign Secretary himself. Douglas Hurd is making time in an incredibly overloaded diary, even in the midst of the Gulf crisis.
Today, tension has been at its highest in Latvia. Officials feared that the pro-Moscow rally there could be used as a cover for an army assault. There were demands that the present parliament should be dissolved and Latvia should be ruled by presidential decree.
Latvia's ethnic Russians had come to show their loyalty to Moscow, and Moscow's army showed its support for them. The circling helicopters, an unmistakable show of strength by the military, broadcasting messages of greetings to the republic's minority who want the Baltics kept in the Soviet Union by force if necessary.
This is a noisy and organised attempt to suggest that there is widespread support in Latvia for the overthrow of the elected government and its replacement by a shadowy, unknown Salvation Committee. And the danger is that it could be used as a pretext for military action.
Outside the government's headquarters, reports that the Russian rally would be the signal for a military coup brought pro-independence demonstrators to the barricades, ready for confrontation. Prime Minister Godmanis appealed for calm and it was a tense 2 hours before the crowds accepted that an assault was no longer imminent. Latvia's President Anatoly Gorbunov had earlier told Parliament that the struggle was reaching a decisive stage. The government approved plans to defend key installations and appealed for international assistance, talking of a possible military coup within the next 48 hours. Pro-Moscow groups have already begun political strikes, hitting factories and Riga's giant port complex, where the largely Russian workforce is opposed to independence. Around the Latvian parliament, defences against a possible assault are becoming stronger and more permanent, and nationalist deputies are remaining defiant. Around the Latvian radio station, makeshift defences and crowds of volunteers could offer little resistance against a concerted attack. But for the moment at least, behind the barbed wire, Latvia's tenuous flame of freedom is still alight. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Riga.
In Lithuania, the funerals have taken place of some of those killed when Soviet troops stormed the television centre in the capital, Vilnius. Tens of thousands joined in the funeral march for 9 of the people who died. All public transport was stopped as the procession was led through the streets to the Roman Catholic Cathedral by 2 bishops and 50 priests.
People lie the apparent victims of the paratroopers' bullets and Red Army tanks. A doctor records his initial findings as to the cause of death. This man, he says, was shot in the side. The bullet hole, he adds, is consistent with the round from an automatic weapon. These pictures were taken by an amateur cameraman and smuggled out of the country. They arrived here in Britain just a few hours ago. The time code and date code on the pictures appear to show it was filmed 4 hours after the bloody end to Vilnius's pro-independence demonstrations on Monday. As the initial post-mortem examinations continue, more bodies are brought in. This man says the doctor clearly looks as though he was run over by a tank. None of these people, he says, died accidentally in the crush. All, says the doctor, were killed by soldiers.
Vilnius is burying its dead, the 13 victims of the Red Army's tanks and paratroopers. Amongst the thousands of dignified mourners, 19-year-old Gintaras Kavalukas, a Lithuanian conscript serving in the Red Army in Russia. He arrived home on leave on Sunday to find his father had been shot dead. He's due back to the army in 3 days' time. He says he will go to tell the truth to his regiment about what happened here. Tens of thousands were drawn through the snow to Vilnius's main cathedral to see the coffins blessed. The mourners now expect direct presidential rule will be imposed to restore Soviet authority, but that could mean more confrontation. For these people have turned their backs on Moscow, proud of their nationalist struggle, even now proud of their dead.
These people have not just come to mourn those who died on Saturday night. 250,000 people on the streets of Vilnius is surely a clear sign to Mikhail Gorbachev that neither the Red Army nor Moscow will stop their bid for independence. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Vilnius.
President Gorbachev is planning to reverse the freedom of the press in the Soviet Union. He's unhappy about how the action of his troops in Lithuania was reported.
Soviet television is portraying the military action in Lithuania as a victorious struggle against subversion. This is 600 Seconds, an investigative program from Leningrad. It's exposed crime and corruption. Its presenter was himself shot recently. But in this report with the troops in Vilnius, 600 Seconds was faithfully towing the party line. Soldiers said they were defending a beleaguered Russian minority. Many Soviet newspapers, however, have not been so charitable. There's been widespread condemnation of the excessive use of force. Mikhail Gorbachev is not happy. Today he proposed the Supreme Soviet should take control of what he called press objectivity. It caused immediate uproar. What's happening to our glasnost, demanded one Ukrainian MP. Declared another, the main thing we achieved in the 5 years of perestroika was relative objectivity of the press. But Mr. Gorbachev insisted, we're going through weeks and months of the most serious decisions. People need objectivity. It's clear tonight that even if he wants the troops to hold back, Mr. Gorbachev is not surrendering his new, tough approach. Many fear the days of glasnost are now coming to an end. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
Tonight, Alexander Yakovlev, once Mr. Gorbachev's closest advisor and the architect of the glasnost policy of openness. In Northern Ireland, a soldier on foot patrol with the Royal Ulster Constabulary
As the Black Berets strutted confidently outside the ministry, Latvia's militiamen answered a call to arms. But at no stage did they return fire. The attack ended as abruptly as it began, with the occupying forces simply pulling out. The scars of battle were everywhere as ministry staff arrived to reclaim their offices today. This woman, Clark, was at her desk when shots ricocheted around her and doesn't know how she survived. But as Riga as a whole recoiled from the shock, there were no words of comfort tonight from the chief of the city's minority communist hardliners. He said he stood for Moscow rule in the republics and the Latvians had brought their troubles on themselves. At Latvia's parliament, the now fully armed militia are as ready as they can be, and they're building the barricades ever higher. At the monument where the victims of violence are remembered, they pray there'll be no more, but no one is confident. The real fear here is that a bloody confrontation would suit Moscow as an excuse to crush Latvia's independence, and that those who killed last night will kill again to provoke that showdown. The people wait. Mike Donkin, BBC News, Riga.
The European community has condemned the troops' action in Latvia and is considering the suspension of technical aid to the Soviet Union. President Bush said he was increasingly concerned by the action and appealed to Moscow not to use further force. The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd summoned the Soviet chargé d'affaires to the Foreign Office to protest in the strongest terms about the shootings. In Moscow, the President of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, strongly attacked the Latvian shootings. Last week, 14 people were shot dead by Soviet troops in Lithuania. Mr. Yeltsin said the actions in the Baltics reflect a new reactionary mood at the Kremlin.
Protesters gathered outside the Russian parliament to express their horror at the killings in the Baltics and their support for Boris Yeltsin, whose outspoken condemnation of Mr. Gorbachev's use of force has placed him firmly at the head of liberal opinion in this country. Inside the parliament, Yeltsin held a minute of silence for the victims and denounced what he called the Kremlin's reactionary U-turn, demanding that those responsible should be brought to justice.
The Soviet leadership does not have the right to use Russian troops in action against unarmed civilians in the settlement of inter-ethnic disputes. Therefore, I say that this parliament must bring to justice the Soviet Minister of Defense, General Yazov, for contravening this law.
With Mr. Gorbachev ditching most of his radical advisers and throwing in his lot with the hardliners, Boris Yeltsin has emerged as the one credible standard-bearer of liberal reform. But his opponents now control the media and the bureaucracy, and Yeltsin is fighting a rearguard action against a return to authoritarianism.
In a hopeful sign for the Liberals, Latvia's Interior Minister tonight said top Kremlin officials had condemned the attack in Riga and had promised measures against its perpetrators. Hours before the clashes, thousands of protesters had denounced Mr. Gorbachev's crackdown in the Baltics, a powerful expression of support for liberal values, but perhaps not enough to save perestroika from the man who first created it. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
The announcement follows a promise made by President Gorbachev to President Bush to ease tensions in the region. 19 people have been killed this month in clashes with Soviet forces there.
For the Lithuanians still standing guard outside their republic's parliament this week, the announcement that Moscow's troops are beginning to leave is the first recompense for their selfless vigil and for the deaths of their comrades at the hands of the Soviet army. Interior Minister Boris Puga said earlier that tension had subsided in the Baltics and his troops were adopting a lower profile.
The situation has stabilized, so we've withdrawn our troops from the centre of Vilnius. I mean those troops which were there at the time of those widely reported events.
Mr. Puga's announcement today in the Rabochaya Tribuna newspaper confirms that the extra troops sent to the Baltics at the start of January are now being withdrawn, including the whole of the paratroop regiment. Also leaving will be 2/3 of the Special Interior Ministry soldiers whose indiscriminate use of force against nationalist demonstrators has been responsible for much of the bloodshed. With the Kremlin seemingly stepping back from the brink of a military takeover, the Baltics have been largely quiet this week, although a shooting at an army checkpoint left a young Lithuanian on a life support machine with serious head wounds.
The withdrawal of the special units is a grudging response to international pressure, but the influence of the hardliners and the military remains strong. And with hundreds of thousands of regular soldiers still in the Baltics, the further use of force has not yet been ruled out. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Has been counting the cost of the Soviet crackdown. Officials today revealed that the Kremlin's month-long campaign, during which 14 people have died, has also destroyed vital equipment, roads, buildings and vehicles, damage worth almost £30 million, they said. The Soviet army still occupies strategic buildings in the capital, Vilnius, but as our Moscow correspondent Gabi Rado now reports, its citizens remain defiant.
Temperatures have in recent days plummeted to minus 20 degrees and below in Vilnius. The barricades remain outside the parliament building, even if many defenders have been driven inside by the cold. Anti-tank defences and giant concrete blocks have an air of frozen permanence. If the seat of the legitimately elected government of Lithuania now looks like a shabby fortified camp, there's a much better defended seat of power across town, a TV station occupied by Soviet army troops. Here the government of the Republic may as well simply not exist. Parliament has said these are foreign troops of occupation, but the army says it's under the direction of no one but the local Communist Party. President Gorbachev's new decree, under which armed soldiers are to patrol with the police, is seen here as a means of legalizing further military occupation. The national anthem is sung at a meeting of Lithuanian TV staff evicted from their workplace. They gather regularly to keep up their spirits and maintain their sense of unity.
Nobody will live by Soviet rule. Nobody. Yes, they can prison us, take to Siberia or something else. But I hope very many people will be Lithuanian Republic citizens.
All through the crisis, the Lithuanian parliament has been holding regular sessions, conducting ordinary business. But the lobbies and corridors outside the chamber have served as dormitories and drilling grounds for scores of young nationalists on permanent guard in case of attack. According to the Communist Party, that vigilance is itself a provocation, justifying the continued presence of the Red Army in the city.
Потому что руководители Верховного Совета
Leaders of the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet are pro-fascists. They've wanted bloodshed in the past. They've called on the people to arm themselves and resist regiments of the Soviet army deployed in the Republic.
Professor Yermolevicius is the party ideology chief and has been linked to the shadowy National Salvation Committee which called in the army on the night of the killings. He says he's only a spokesman for the committee.
The National Salvation Committee says it has suspended activities. But it's stated that if Soviet laws are not enforced in the Republic and the situation is out of control, then the committee promises to resume its activities.
In the city's hospitals, more than 30 people are still recovering from injuries sustained either during the army crackdown or since then in numerous nighttime shooting incidents. They've fed fears and rumors all across Lithuania. The legs of this young woman were crushed under the tracks of an army tank at the television tower. Her friend died beside her. X-rays show a bullet lodged in the brain of a young man shot by security forces at a checkpoint. He died 2 days later. Other reminders of the ever-present crisis, the city's main publishing house, its entrance blocked up, the building occupied by soldiers who now stay out of sight. And the inside of the Republic's former Department of Defense, ransacked by troops who stayed there for 2 weeks and then suddenly left.
The current confusion, with troops in command of just a few buildings scattered across Vilnius, may well suit the pro-Moscow faction quite well. They might be hoping that intimidation will make people withdraw into themselves, tailor their expectations, put off independence. Uncertainty may be Moscow's long-term policy.
President Landsbergis, who has lived and worked inside Parliament during the entire crisis, has claimed throughout that Mr. Gorbachev was directly responsible for the tragedy.
Moscow ordered the army in, and only they can order them out. It may be that after their unsuccessful attempt to overthrow our government, they are trying to take over a little piece at a time. The people and organizations here are resisting this.
Hymns are regularly sung for those who died during and after the storming of the television buildings. Since then, the world outside has turned its attention to the Gulf War, adding to the Lithuanians' fear that they stand alone in their independence struggle, the West too preoccupied to help them. With an occupying force openly challenging the leaders elected by the people, nationalists feel that these are Lithuania's most
aspects of Soviet society, but recently he gained international recognition when he won the Prix Italia for his documentary series Hello, Do You Hear Us?, about ethnic and political tensions in the Soviet Union.
Juris Podniaks is a film and video documentary maker of extraordinary talent who has smelt gunpowder. He is always at the center of any trouble or conflicts in the world. More recently, he covered horrific events in Tbilisi, as well as Baku and other places of conflict and unrest in the Soviet Union. The pictures Juris Podniaks managed to record in Vilnius, in Lithuania, during these last few bloody days are amazing. When Juris first showed this film on Latvian TV, we realized for the first time exactly what was happening. That the Soviet army had shot at innocent people, had occupied the TV center. We immediately thought that the same may happen in Riga.
We were ready for something. That's why we went to Vilnius, in Lithuania. But when it started, it reminded me of my last film, Hello, Do You Hear Us?, in Georgia, when those same tank eyes appeared. I didn't know if there were any other cameras. All I wanted to do was fix this on film. I couldn't believe it. I just kept thinking, you pigs, how can you do this? I was rifle-butted, but kept filming so that the rest of the world would know the truth.
We have to be thankful for Juris's film, which was the best reply to the lies broadcast by Central TV in Moscow. The Russian director Niezyurovs, who has close contacts with the KGB, made a video about Vilnius in the series called 600 Seconds. It was finished only 3 days after the Vilnius shootings and shocked with its distortion of the fact.
Aldonos Pocienės is a Lithuanian teacher from Vilnius with 4 school-aged children. She is on a short visit to this country. Last year, the Lithuanian parliament passed a declaration of independence from the Soviet Union, and soon afterwards Latvia followed suit. But the Soviet government tried to halt move towards independence, and troops were moved into the Baltic states. 2 weeks ago, 15 people were killed when soldiers took over the television station in Vilnius. But this week, during talks in Washington over the timing of the next Bush-Gorbachev summit, the Soviet Union promised that it would reopen talks with Baltic leaders and withdraw many of the troops. Aldonos Pocienės believes that the West has made a grave mistake in trusting President Gorbachev, with tragic consequences for the people of the various Soviet republics.
At this very moment, thousands of Lithuanians, including my husband and 3 sons, aged 16, 12 and 10, are standing behind barricades defending the parliament building in Vilnius. The barricades are little more than symbolic, but underline our determination to preserve our regained democratic independence. Why are whole families standing side by side daily defending the parliament? Why have they chosen to brave the bitter cold of winter, risking a similar fate to those citizens who were brutally killed by Soviet paratroops on the night of January the 13th? You in the West do not realize that nothing has changed in the Soviet Union. You made the mistake of taking Gorbachev at face value. After 1940, when Lithuania was annexed by the Soviet Union, over a third of its population was either murdered, sent to labor camps, deported, or died in the resistance. My father was arrested and sent to a labor camp in northern Russia. He spent 2.5 years in hard labor before escaping and walking back to Lithuania. Many others were not so lucky. They either died in Siberia and other God-forsaken wastelands, or were just murdered. Our desire for self-determination has helped us to survive the brutal Soviet oppression, which has dragged our once healthy standard of living down to the level of the rest of the Soviet Union. Perestroika, so admired by the West, proved to be only cosmetic in paving the way for democracy in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's policy abroad has differed so much from his policy at home. He played a very democratic man at the United Nations, proclaiming every nation's sacred right to self-determination. But he becomes his true self at home. He sends in troops and crushes every spark of real freedom and democracy in Yerevan, Tbilisi, Baku, and Chisinau. Why did Nobel Prize winner Gorbachev send the Soviet army to Lithuania on the pretext of ethnic strife, when no ethnic strife existed and not a single Russian or Pole had been injured? Most people in Lithuania supported the Declaration of Independence on March the 11th, 1990. Lithuanians and also most Russians and Poles voted for the Landsbergis government and independent Lithuania. The only source of tension has been the presence of the Soviet army and the blatant lies and propaganda of the Kremlin. On the 13th of January, the Soviet arms opened fire without warning on innocent singing and praying civilians.
They attacked unarmed crowds, fired shots above their heads, then among them. At the television tower, battle tanks wheeled and roared, crushing protesters into the mud and against the fences.
Why was Gorbachev able to resort to old-style Soviet military action? We got a very warm public response in the West, but none of your governments gave us any official support. An independent Lithuanian government has been in power for more than 9 months, but still no Western country has recognized it. Since 1940, the West has never officially accepted the Soviet occupation. Why don't you now recognize the democratically elected government of Lithuania? Only then will Gorbachev hold good faith negotiations with the Baltic states. If you truly believe in democracy, can you not turn your attention from the Gulf to give us recognition? Otherwise, when I go home, what can I say to my children who took part in all the demonstrations and rallies and who are so confident about the bright future of Lithuania? Without official Western support, I fear a Soviet overthrow of the Lithuanian government. If the Baltic states are crushed, then the democratic forces in the other captive nations of the Soviet Union will also be crushed. And the world will face the danger and instability of the vengeful and merciless military dictatorship which will follow.